Jeffry hated jack-o'-lanterns. This was a problem, since his hometown was known as the jack-o'-lantern capital of the United States. Every year, the town was host to thousands, if not millions, of carved horrors. It had become a point of pride for their Midwestern town. The town had been full of pumpkins since its founding back in the 1800s, and the town was filled with glowing, grinning gourds from September till April. The public commons had 3 large greenhouses that grew pumpkins during the cold months, and no citizen had to pay for one of those pumpkins. Jeffry was pretty sure it came out of their taxes, along with road works and the police force. Jeffry had grown up carving, eating, and hating pumpkins with a red-hot fury. As a child, the glowing gourds had frightened him. His parents were never sure why, but he was terrified of them. Until he was 7, Jeffry had refused to even carve one, and he remembered getting into some trouble several times for pushing them off the porch. It never stopped a new one from appearing where the old one had been, but it always came with a stern talking to about wasting pumpkins. Pumpkins were a hot commodity in the town, and were not something to be squandered. By the time he was 17, his fear had turned into a deep hatred. A hatred that had brought him to this moment. Jeffry was sitting on the commons with his friends when he got an idea. Hey, what if we pulled a prank on Halloween? Like a big one. Chris looked up, cigarette smoke curling over his face, while Chris leaned over his handlebars and grinned stupidly at Jeffry. What kind of prank? Chris asked, cigarette hanging from his mouth like a modern-day cowboy. Chris was your typical greasy teenage troublemaker. He was decked out in a leather jacket, ripped jeans, black boots, and a constant need to smoke the cigarettes he usually lifted from his dad. Chris likely considered himself some kind of badass, and Jeffry had seen him make good on enough of the idle threats he made to agree with him. Despite this, Chris was the most stable of Jeffry's friends, and he made quite the contrast to the grinning idiot leaning on his handlebars. Something big, something they'll never forget, Jeffry said, grinning hugely. Jeffry was watching them unload a wagon of pumpkins from the greenhouse as they loitered on the commons. Jeffry wanted nothing so much as to watch them all become compost. Like, maybe some soap in the fountain again? Kevin suggested. Kevin was the polar opposite of Chris. If Chris looked like a greaser, Kevin looked like a generic Chad. Blonde hair, blue eyes, tap-out t-shirt, gold chains, wind pants, and lots of pictures on his phone of his well-crafted physique. Kevin and Chris had been Jeffry's friends for a long time, but the truth was that he mostly just used them as muscle. He wanted them in case things went south, and something like this had the potential to go very wrong very quickly. No, Kevin, something a little bigger this time. I'm thinking about smashing some pumpkins on Halloween night. Kevin grinned, but Chris raised a pierced eyebrow at him. Are you kidding? You know how anal this town is about those damn pumpkins. If we go around people's houses and smash up their jack-o'-lanterns. No, I'm not just talking about the ones on people's houses. I want to smash all the pumpkins. The ones at the houses, the ones at the shops, and the displays on the commons too. The two of them looked at him in stunned silence. By morning, I don't want a single jack-o'-lantern in the whole town unpulped. Kevin grinned like a shot fox, nodding his head and raising his hand for a high five. Jeffry obliged him, holding his hand up to Chris next. Chris didn't say anything, though. His lips were slowly creeping into a distinctive evil grin as he thought about the implications, and he slapped his own palm against Jeffrey's at long last. Chris was smart, probably smarter than anyone Jeffry knew, but he loved a good trick as much as anyone. The idea of all the townspeople seeing their pumpkins smashed, their town pride destroyed, made him feel like the Grinch at the end of the movie, sans the change of heart, of course. We'll be legends, more than legends. We'll be infamous, Chris said as he pulled his hand into a raised fist. Jeffry laughed. Boys, I guarantee that the day after Halloween will go down in town history when we're done. As they sat on the commons and started to flesh out their plans, Jeffry had no idea how right he was. They stood in Jeffry's garage later that day and made plans. Halloween was 5 days away, and they had to make sure that they could commit their prank and get away with it unscathed. Being arrested for a stunt like this would only elevate their street cred, but Jeffry was honestly a little worried about how the town would take what they were getting ready to do. As the three rode through town to get to Jeffrey's house, they passed through the downtown and saw the shops littered with pumpkins. The plaque that commemorated when the world's largest pumpkin had come through town with the fair one year showed resplendently on the front lawn of the town hall. The display table of pumpkins outside Jack-o'-lantern's museum made the table sag under their orange mass. Jeffrey thought once again how vital the stupid things were to the town. They would get in real trouble for this, so the first order of business would be masks. "They'll need to be full face, too," Chris put in when Jeffrey brought it up. "I don't want them seeing our hair, our noses, and identifying us somehow." Kevin laughed. "Easy. My bro and I are heading to Seaver Friday night. You guys slide me some cash for masks, and I'll bring back some quality stuff." Jeffrey looked at Chris, and he looked back at him. This was a big ask from Kevin, a guy who still got lost on his way to school sometimes. Kevin's role in the gang was muscle, that was obvious, and trusting him with something like this was a stretch. If he got distracted when he and his bro got to Seaver, they could be out of money and have no masks for this caper. Chris was right when he said full face mask would be a must, and the shops in town wouldn't have what they were looking for. Kevin must have noticed the look, because he got a little frustrated. "Oh, come on, guys, I can do this. Do you want good masks or not?" Chris shrugged at Jeffrey, who sighed as he took out his wallet and handed Kevin a 20. Kevin looked at Chris, opening and closing his hand as he crumpled Jeffrey's 20 in his grip. Chris dropped his motorcycle boots off the table and rolled his eyes, pulling out a 20 of his own and adding it to the pile. Kevin reached into his wind pants and took out a 20 of his own, adding it to the pile before pushing the whole wad into his pocket. They were taking a big chance on Kevin, and both made sure he damn well knew it. The next 5 days were agony for Jeffrey. He couldn't tell anyone what they were planning to do. That would ruin the prank, but they still had to make sure they had an alibi. Providence threw them a bone on that one because their friend Mark was having a Halloween party that night. One RSVP later, and they made the party part of their plans. People would see them, they would remember that they had been there, and Jeffrey and his friends could sneak out at 9:30 and be back home before any of the booze-soaked brains had time to miss them. It was the perfect plan, and promised to give the boys maximum deniability if questioned. Even so, Jeffrey didn't sleep well that week. He was plagued with dreams that he would stagger awake from and fall back into as soon as he closed his eyes. Jeffrey saw himself smashing jack-o'-lantern after jack-o'-lantern, a deep fog surrounding everything as he moved from gourd to gourd. All the while, something watched him from that haze. Jeffrey couldn't see it, but it was big. Its red eyes seemed pleased at what he was doing. Now and again, Jeffrey would raise his bat and salute to the mysterious figure, and it would rear back and cackle like a demon. These dreams terrified him, but Jeffrey always woke up feeling elated at the regard of this creature. The three seemed to plan constantly that week. They would use their bikes as transportation. Jeffrey figured their bikes would cut around with less notice than a car, and they would be faster than on foot. He figured they would have about an hour and a half tops to pull this off before the devastation was noticed, and speed would be critical to the operation. Kevin had some baseball bats in the shed that they planned to use, and the three of them began to map their route. As long as Kevin got the masks, they'd be home free. He winked at them Friday afternoon as his brother came to pick him up from school. "Don't forget," Jeffrey reminded him. "I've got this, guys," Kevin scoffed, hopping into the Jeep as the two peeled out for Seaver. Chris and Jeffrey parted ways then, hoping against hope that they would have the last pieces of the puzzle soon. Chris sent him a text later that night saying, "I still haven't heard from Kevin." Jeffrey sighed as he buried his face against the pillow. Kevin had better not mess this up. Chris came over the following day and found Jeffrey in the garage. He was oiling the chain on his bike when Chris pulled up. He was preparing for tonight, and Chris looked put out. Jeffrey could guess the source of his anger. Kevin had been radio silent since yesterday at school. Not a text, not a call, not anything. He forgot, and you know it," Chris said. "We don't know that," Jeffrey said, trying to remain positive. Though brilliant, Chris could be volatile and was prone to moodiness sometimes. Jeffrey didn't want him bailing out at the last minute. "He won't return my text, and his phone goes straight to voicemail. If he and his brother spent the night in Seaver, we could be screwed." Jeffrey started to speak, but at that moment, a familiar Jeep pulled up in his driveway. Kevin leaned in to say something to his brother, before taking a brown paper sack from the back seat as the Jeep drove off and Kevin approached the pair. He was all smiles, not reading the room at all, and when Chris walked towards him, he spread his arms out as he prepared to wrap him in one of his annoying bro hugs. When Chris socked him in the gut instead, Kevin's grin faded as he groaned and fell to his knees. Jeffry pulled him back, but Kevin took it in strides as Jeffry tried to pull the greaser away from him. "What was that for?" Kevin gasped, not really hurt, but definitely startled. "That is for bugging out and going radio silent for the last 24 hours. I dropped my phone in a puddle about 5 minutes after we got there. I didn't realize you two were so worried about me." Chris balled up his fists, straining against Jeffry as he tried to hit Kevin again. Jeffry pushed the greaser into a nearby recliner, kicking up a cloud of dust as he tried to settle Chris. "No worries, as long as you got the masks," Jeffry said, still not holding out hope for the scatterbrained musclehead. Kevin's grin threatened to cut his head in half. "Oh, I got the masks. I think you'll find them very fitting, too." Jeffry took the bag from Kevin, feeling the thick rubber masks inside the plain grocery bag. He reached in and pulled out a ghoulish orange mask that made him grin as wide as Kevin. The plastic thing looked like a demented jack-o'-lantern, its gaping black mouth cut into a frightening double row of teeth. Its black eyes were angled with malice, and Jeffry could see a few plastic roaches crawling up the nostrils as he took it in. It was perfect. Jeffry couldn't believe that Kevin had picked this out. It would be fitting to attack the town's established idols with their very likeness adorning their faces. He tossed a second mask to Chris, and the greaser goggled like a fool as he took in the ghoulish thing. Jeffry could feel a lot of the anxiety melting away, and when he raised his hand this time, it was to give Kevin a hearty high five. "Kev, these are perfect." "You act like I would bring you anything less," Kevin said, with no small amount of swagger. Jeffry pulled the mask on, feeling the plastic set on his face like a second skin. "Tonight, we're gonna make history." As the sun began to set and the trick-or-treaters started to gather on the sidewalk, the three set off on their bikes. They had their bats and their masks stored in their backpack, along with the required 6-pack of beer to get into the party. They had dressed darkly in black pants and hoodies, and they were prepared to ride the streets like phantoms after dark. They arrived at Mark's party about 7, the festivities already in full swing. It was a typical high school underage drinking party. Lots of people making out in the living room, a collective of smoke clouds around the back and the front porch, people dancing around to loud music, and a kitchen that was 5 parts wet bar and 5 parts buffet. Mark's parents were out of town. They always seemed to be out of town, and Mark's house was typically the place where parties happened. The three stood around and sipped warm beer, keeping an eye on their watches, their nerves tuned up to 1,000,000,000. They didn't want to be there too long, just long enough to get noticed. They would say hi to some people from school, play a few rounds of beer pong, and at 9:45 they would slip out and take their bikes off quietly. They had been going over their individual routes for days. Chris would take 5th through 6th Street, Kevin would take 7th through 10th Street, and Jeffry would take 11th through 15th Street. There were roughly 5 to 10 houses per street, and everyone would meet up downtown when they were done. If someone got done early, they would start smashing pumpkins downtown and wait for the others. If the cops came, they would run. The person discovered would lead them away so the others could keep smashing, and then meet back up when they lost them. They would not assume the vandals were organized. They would think they were holiday pranksters out for fun, and if they grabbed one of them, the other two could finish the night's work before anyone was the wiser. When Jeffrey's watch jangled to let them know it was 9:45, the three of them snuck out the back and rode off into the night. They split off at 10 o'clock. The front porch is dark, save for the glow of the jacks, and the streets were mostly free of trick-or-treaters. Jeffry slipped on his mask as he came to 11th Street, grinning beneath it as he pulled his bat out. The first gourd he hit exploded in a shower of orange skin and wet innards. He smiled beneath the mask, smashing the other two and moving on to the next. The pumpkins were old by now, starting to rot, and his bat made quick work of them. Jeffry had finished with the street in no time, his arm burning from the effort, but his desire for more burning hotter still. He had seen people peeking from their windows, but no blue and whites coming to chase him away. The work seemed too easy. The jack-o'-lanterns flew apart with a single swing of the bat, and Jeffry reveled in the feel of his anger and fear being satiated. He would look back on that feeling throughout his years and feel deep shame, but tonight it was all about his revenge on the source of his terror. Jeffry was not challenged until 12th Street. He had gotten cocky halfway through his culling. He wasn't content to just smash the pumpkins anymore. Oh no. Jeffry had started throwing them against trees, mailboxes, and the houses that set silent guardians over them. No one came out to challenge him, their love for their pumpkins going only so far, and Jeffry felt untouchable as he shattered his latest gourd against the door of 3608 12th Street. When the man lumbered from beside the porch, laying hands on Jeffry as the boy grabbed for another pumpkin, Jeffry was terrified for half a second. The mask had become turned in his effort, and he hadn't seen the man as he started sneaking around. The light was poor, but Jeffry was pretty sure it was Mr. Bask, his English teacher. He was standing in his bathrobe and asking Jeffry just what the hell he thought he was doing as he tried to wrestle the last of his pumpkins from him. Jeffry had a short and squishy tug-of-war with Mr. Bask, and finally had the bright idea to just let the hateful gourd go. Jeffry's fingers had started to slide through the thin skin at the pumpkin's base anyway, and the last thing he wanted was slime all over his hands. The old man stumbled backwards as Jeffry released his hold and fell on his backside as the pumpkin splattered against him, covering him in soupy guts and rotten seeds. He looked at Jeffry for a moment, so lost and afraid of this pumpkin demon who had visited his wrath on his home, and for a moment, Jeffry came to his senses. He started towards him, wanting to help him up, but then the shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find a true demon standing on the sidewalk. He was standing in the shadow of a giant inflatable pumpkin, and the street lights seemed loath to touch him. He was massive, a huge shadowed figure of steel and green. When he sliced the inflatable pumpkin with his axe or sword or whatever he carried, it sputtered in death as it puddled on the lawn. Jeffry was frozen by him for a moment, his terror and anger at the pumpkins paling compared to his madness at the sight of this creature. Then it spoke, the voice of winter, and he was once again filled with that potent fire. "To hell with him! Your work must be fulfilled!" Jeffry nodded, mounting his bike and riding off without a second glance at the prone man he'd left behind. By the time Jeffry finished his work, it was nearly midnight. He had taken so long. How had he taken so long? He had been so taken by the act of destruction that Jeffry had lost track of time. He was surprised that no one else had come out to challenge him, and wondered how no one had called the police yet. Jeffry's clothes were splattered with pumpkin, his mask caked with dried seeds and goopy rind, but he didn't feel tired in the least bit. Quite the contrary. Jeffry felt an almost maniacal need to see more pumpkins squashed beneath his bat. He rode downtown, feeling the cold breeze drive him forward, the chill stroking the blaze of his revenge. The fell breeze felt like oncoming winter, and it seemed to lend Jeffry its power. As Jeffry rode into downtown, he passed the remains of many smashed jack-o'-lanterns on the way. Chris and Kevin had been busy, it would seem. Tables had been overturned, and the gaping holes from the pumpkins greeted him as he rode. They had thrown them in the street, smashed windows on the storefronts, and scattered the guts of numerous gourds everywhere. If Jeffry had been in his right mind, he would have doubtlessly seen this as a little too much. They hadn't agreed to this level of vandalism, nothing even close to this magnitude, but at that moment, Jeffry was emboldened by the sight of such destruction. This was his will, so Jeffry thought, and he would reward them for their efforts. Jeffry felt the mist gathering over the town as much as he saw it. Its icy fingers were making chill bumps pop out on his arms, and he found himself looking for the figure on the sidewalk. Jeffry expected him to appear out of the mist and cackle, congratulating Jeffry for orchestrating such a fine bit of mischief, but if he was there, he was staying hidden for now. Jeffry found Kevin and Chris on the commons. It seemed that this was where the police had been. The cruiser's blue and white lights were cutting through the fog, but they couldn't hold a candle to the blaze that burned on the commons. Jeffry gawked at it, speechless at the towering bonfire the two had created. They had set the greenhouses on fire. They had set a pyre and called the police right to them. In his wonder and disbelief, though, Jeffry forgot to keep an eye peeled for trouble. Someone pushed him suddenly, spilling him into the street. They fell on him as he wrenched his arms painfully behind his back, and the fall had knocked the wind out of him. He didn't have the strength to fight them off, and when they lifted Jeffry to his feet, they shouted for him to stop resisting. Jeffry was shoved towards a strobing vehicle and pushed into the back seat. He shimmied to the other side, wanting to see if his friends would escape, but what Jeffrey saw was far from what he had expected. Outside, Kevin and Chris were backing into the fog that swirled around the commons. The police were moving in, nightsticks in hand, and the cop that had cuffed Jeffrey was moving up behind them as he yelled into his radio. He didn't seem to be reaching the person that he wanted, though, because Jeffrey saw him jerk his head away as it crackled and sparked in his ear. He cursed and pulled it off, stomping on the box as it caught fire, and looked away from his fellow officers as he tried to put it out. That's why he didn't notice the figure that came riding out of the fog. But Jeffrey saw him. He saw his red eyes first, glowing from high in the fog as he came up behind his friends. He was tall, nearly 10 feet, and Jeffrey saw the two officers freeze as they noticed him. He came between Chris and Kevin, a single hoof stepping from the fog as his horse parted the mist. His armored form came next, his armor forest green, his horned helm the color of moss, his sword shrieking like a wildcat as he drew it out. Kevin and Chris didn't even look at him. Their pumpkin heads were still fixed on the officers. He was far more fantastic than Jeffrey could have imagined. Neither his dream nor the phantom on the sidewalk had done him justice. And when he charged, the officers broke like quail. Jeffrey heard him laugh, that bitter cackle that had haunted his dreams. When he sliced down the first officer, the man tried to impose his flimsy nightstick into the path of that vorpal blade. It sheared through the nightstick, the man's ballistic vest, and finally through his flesh. He fell to the ground in pieces, and the other two cops looked at the twitching pieces a little too long. The figure laid into them with gusto, and Jeffrey jumped as a head bounced off the front glass and rested on the hood. The rider slew them all, rode them down like children, and when he rode towards the cruiser, Jeffrey knew that he had arrived. The Green Man had returned. He leapt the car and rode into town, Chris and Kevin following mutely behind him. Jeffrey pivoted in the seat, screaming for them to help him. He kicked the door, kicked the glass until it splintered into a cascade of spider webs. But the rider and his grotesque minions were already disappearing into the fog. They left him there with the bodies. They left him there to take the blame. Jeffrey kicked until his legs ached. He screamed until his throat felt like it would break. He pulled on the cuffs until his wrists bled. In the end, though, it didn't matter in the slightest. More cops arrived as the mist dissipated. Jeffrey was taken to jail, his mask removed, and his identity discovered. He was thrown in a jail cell, alone, while the cops tried to sort out the havoc that was going on around town. Calls were coming in from all over town. 17 more deaths were reported that night. Fires were blazing in several homes, broken sprinklers and fire hydrants that seemed to have frozen in the balmy October air, and too much vandalism to keep track of. Mark's party had been turned into a bloodbath, and the kids who had escaped were saying that it was a guy with a sword and two guys in pumpkin masks with bats. Through it all, Jeffrey just sat in a dejected state in his cell. They had left him. He had been found unworthy, and now he would rot like one of those pumpkins he had shattered into so much useless paste. At some point, Jeffrey must have dozed off, because when he returned to himself, the sheriff was leaning against the bars of his cell, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Good. You're awake." Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how everything seems to go to hell the second I decide to leave town for an evening. My granddaughter wanted me to take her trick-or-treating, so I drove to the next town over to oblige her, and come back to a whole mess of problems. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Jeffrey said nothing. "Funny how you decided to smash up all the pumpkins. You know why the early citizens carved those pumpkins, don't you?" Jeffrey continued saying nothing. "Sure you do. There's a mural in the museum. You've probably seen it 1,000 times, but never really thought much about it. The settlers that founded this place came fleeing something they didn't really understand, something they prayed they had left in the old country. That image on the mural of the tide riding down on us, that's not English invaders as we sometimes pretend for the tourists. Granddad said his granddad told him stories of the Green Man, a spirit of winter who sought sacrifice and punished those who would not give him his due. Through it all, Jeffry said nothing. That's why we light the jack-o'-lanterns. That's why the tradition is still here today. We light them so we might forget that demon who once haunted us. We light them because they keep him away. You've left us naked in the breeze, boy. You've burned our greenhouses, smashed our talismans, and now there'll be nothing to stop him from coming back tonight. The sheriff stared at him, but Jeffry said nothing. Did you see him, boy? Did you see that devil? He wrung his hands over the bars like a drowning man treading water, but Jeffry refused to answer him. After he'd wrung those bars for a few minutes, the sheriff finally left. Jeffry never saw him again. Jeffry never saw much of anyone ever again. When he heard the creak and groan of pavement and metal being separated, Jeffry smiled. He knew they had come for him, and when the bars on the street parted from the cement, he looked up to see Kevin and Chris had returned for him. They were still wearing their masks, but Jeffry had an idea that those masks weren't rubber anymore. Jeffry had an idea that those masks were permanent now, and his would be too, once he slipped it on. Jeffry crawled onto street level, falling to his knees when he saw that he was with them. The voice in his head told him that he needed one more. Those two imps needed a leader. The rider tossed something rubber to the pavement at Jeffrey's feet, and with trembling hands, Jeffry slid the grotesque pumpkin mask back on. The voice told him he had work to do. The green man called Jeffry to action, and who was he to deny him? Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you enjoyed tonight's story, and you're not already subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Go ahead and hit that notification bell, so you don't miss any of the spooky stuff we do here. You could probably stand another story, right? There's plenty more where this came from. Don't forget to check out my playlists if you have a favorite. There's lots of links below to my latest book on Amazon, also to my Patreon if you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion. Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks to Xaronana, Emily Coltsfoot, Martha, and Marianne Schuler for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. Patreon has all sorts of wonderful tiers. Our Ghostly Reader tiers get a book every time I write one, so at least twice a year, you get a signed copy of my latest book on your doorstep. But there are other rewards as well, having your name read out at the end, getting your spooky a little early, all kinds of things. So, what are you waiting for? Come on down and see what all the fuss is about. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.